Hello and welcome back to Rebecca. It is finally time for my favorite fiction of 2023. I read a ton in 2023. If you've been around, you know I was having a fabulous reading year, so there was a lot to choose from. Probably one of my best reading years, both in volume. It was not quite my highest in terms of book count, but highest volume was very close. And also the quality. I had so many 4 and 5 star reads. So these are not necessarily ranked in any way. I sort of loosely grouped them into genre categories just to keep them together and make it easier for myself, but they're not in any necessary order. I also didn't limit myself to a certain number, but I kind of wound up with about 3 per category that I put, however, some over, some under. And these were purely what I went with my heart on. Some of them may not even be a 5-star read, but they're ones that were more memorable to me. So these are what stuck with me for the year, really. So getting into the context of my reading, if you have not seen my videos before, I read across all genres, I read all types of books. So probably the noticeable standout for me is that there aren't any mystery thrillers on this list. And I do read mystery and thriller. I mean, I read a fair amount of cozy mysteries, I would say, or a few per year, and those I generally kind of expect to be about 3 stars. They're not super memorable, but I enjoy reading them anyway. So none of those quite made it. I did have a standout thriller, I guess, that I would say was Thursday's Children by Nicci from the Free Decline series. And if I were to put a favorite thriller on here, it would be that one. But again, I felt like it was the standout of that series and probably of my mystery thriller reading, but it wasn't really a new favorite that I'm going to find memorable in a year or two. So I really don't have any to add in that category. So that was a noticeable miss for me. But I do still enjoy reading mystery and thrillers. Other things are that I read a lot of anthologies and collections, and I didn't have any of those that were absolute standouts. And I think that's kind of the nature of collections, that they're very uneven in most cases, so it's rare that you have a true standout, memorable collection. But I was surprised. I read several collections and anthologies, and none of them showed up on my favorites. So I guess with that preamble, I don't want to make this a super long video, so I'm going to try to keep myself brief on these topics. And also share with you how much I love these books without gushing too long. So let's dive into the books that I loved in 2023. My first category is Biggest Surprise. This is probably the equivalent of an honorable mentions. These are all books that stood out to me over the year, but didn't quite reach favorites in their genre categories. So the first of those is Camp Damascus by Chuck Tingle. This has actually shown up on quite a few people's favorites lists. I've been a little surprised to see it there, but it is a really wonderful horror novel, very well executed. I guess I shouldn't be surprised. Tingle is an experienced author. However, this was the first foray into traditionally published horror, and it really blew me away. I was quite surprised by the nuance that it executed, the intelligence in exploring religious themes through this horror story about a very controlling religious group who run a very successful gay conversion camp. And it's really insidious. So I love the ways that it explored the themes. It was smart. It was engrossing in terms of the content and propulsive action. But it also really was emotional. So it hit me very personally because I have kind of a background in evangelical religion, and this certainly explored those themes. The next one was Upside Down Magic by Lauren Miracle, Sarah Milnowski, and Emily Jenkins. This is a very young middle grade, so if you don't read middle grade and you aren't into that, this might not be for you. But for me, it captured that true magic that we look for in middle grade fantasy. And not only that, but it's a really good magic school novel. So I was not expecting it to be as high quality as it was because it is so far on the younger end. But this was great. It captures this wonderful story of a girl who is the daughter of the headmaster of the elite magic school, and she doesn't make it in because her magic is wonky. It doesn't work the right way. And so she gets sent to public school. How dare they? So I loved that aspect of really making public school a positive thing rather than elitism. I loved that we have this class that she goes to specifically for people who have upside down magic. So it's all about being different and embracing your difference. And we also have a wonderful teacher who has strong Miss Frizzle vibes. And it was just so charming and really wonderful. And I will be certainly continuing on with that series. And the third big surprise was The Voyages of Cinrak the Dapper by A.J. Fitzwater. This is a collection of short stories, sort of, but it's more a mosaic novel of the life of Cinrak the Dapper, all the way from being a young capybara dreaming of becoming a pirate from the orphanage that she's growing up in to her actual piracy and having a successful crew on the high seas. All the wonderful wild animals that she encounters and sea creatures. It was a delight. It's also a queer norm setting and very, very intriguing how that is worked in through this pirate narrative. But it was a really adventure-filled, fun story. The next category is short fiction, which is mostly kind of under the 50-page range, individual stories. These are all sci-fi, and I think they're all available to read online, so I will link them down below in the description box if they are. The first one is Victor LaValle's We Travel the Spaceways. This is an author I've read from before, but I definitely need to delve into his work even more because I have loved everything I've read from him. And this is a story following a homeless man who hears voices from the tin cans that he collects. Now, is that his mental health, or is that a real, true connection to something higher? He makes friends with a trans woman who understands what he's talking about, and they form a bond and connection that he's never had before. I listened to this on audio, and that did really amp up the experience because the audio narration was so good. So this only took, I think, like an hour, but it really impacted me for the whole year because the characterization, the storytelling is so phenomenal. Next is The Empty by Ray Naylor, another really great example of character driving a story forward. We're completely from the very limited perspective of this worker for a company somewhat like Amazon, in a bit of a near future wage slave position, who is driving delivery drones. And this drone driver sort of sees something that changes the trajectory of their career. And it really had twists and turns. It was kind of depressingly capitalist, corporatist commentary. And actually, number 3 on the list is also in that vein. It was We Built This City by Marie Virbert, which is following, again, someone very bottom rung in a very capitalist society, working hard to clean the dome surrounding their sort of space city. And belts are ever tightening. They don't want to pay people to do this job effectively, even though it's keeping everyone alive. And things progress forward. It's got great anti-capitalist themes along with the previous. And I just loved the exploration of that, and that it was mostly about thinking through the philosophy of this work mentality. So those were all fantastic short stories that had such a big impact in such a small package for me this year. Then I have my best comics of the year. I had so many great comics. This was really hard to narrow down, but let's start with Cyclopedia Exotica by Arminder Dhaliwal. These are like comic strips and single panel comics. So it's not necessarily a story arc, but the comics are absolutely building a story across these multiple disparate pieces. And the Cyclopedia element is Cyclops people. But that's used as an analog for bodily difference of many types, as well as things like gender and sexuality. And it is using this to really explore otherness in a way that I haven't seen done with such nuance and variety in sort of a single story. And I really, really enjoyed the way that it handled that. Then we have much lighter fare so Cyclopedia Exotica was funny. It was not all heavy. Mamo by Sass Millage is light, cozy, contemporary fantasy. It's a teen level comic, and it's following a teen witch who's sort of a community caretaker through witchcraft. And I just enjoyed it so much. It seems to be a standalone, but I would love to see more adventures following this teen witch. Then we have SpyxFamily Volume 4 specifically, but I love the whole SpyxFamily series. I think everyone does. If you have somehow missed out on what this is, it's a really charming manga that is following a family recruited by a spy in order for his mission to be fulfilled. But he has to get his daughter into the academy of his target's child to make friends with him so he can kind of make the connections he needs to. And so he recruits a wife who happens to be an assassin, and he adopts a daughter who happens to be a telepath. And so she knows exactly what's going on. The wife as the assassin has no clue, and the spy also has no clue about the secrets of everyone in the family. And it is just so delightful, so charming, so entertaining, and Volume 4 specifically is about them adopting a dog. And the whole story arc of this volume is perfect. Next up, my best sequels of 2023. One I read toward the very end of the year was Mammoths at the Gates by Nevo, the fourth in the Singing Hills cycle. This was so wonderful. It didn't quite beat out the first novella, but it was really, really close. This is such a wonderful series. Again, charming is going to be the word of the day for many of these books, but this series follows a quiet cleric monk of the Singing Hills monastery who goes around traveling to collect stories. And that is the purpose of this monastery. And so the focus on storytelling as a key is so wonderful. And in this particular volume, we're dealing with grief, where Chi, our cleric, shows up back at the monastery they've been away from and see that there are mammoths at the gates. And on their return, there's something big going on. And she has to process that they have changed, that the monastery has changed while they've been away. And it just has so much to say in such a quiet little package. I adore this series. Then we have Nona the Ninth, just about completely the opposite from that. It's loud, bombastic. Nona is probably the most sci-fi book of this entire series, the Locked Tomb series by Tamsin Muir. And I think it's my favorite of the entire Locked Tomb series as well. So in this one, we're following a character, Nona, who has newly been introduced. We haven't seen her before, and she is very unusual. She kind of seems like she is new to this world. So we follow her as she's going about her day in a very dystopian setting, really unusual world, but surrounded by people who care for her deeply and really strongly want to protect her. So it has a really strong, caring vibe. And Nona, you do just want to protect. She is a tiny little being you want to hold in your arms and keep safe. And yet there are big bad things going on in this world. So it's very action-packed. It's a wild ride. I feel like this particular entry into the Locked Tomb series delivered on so much that we had questions about before, explaining so much of the world building. So I felt like all of those payoffs for Muir's setup from the previous novels are what skyrocketed this to the top of my sequels. And the word for world is for a spiders like Harlequin is my last best sequel. And this was heartbreaking because it's the final Hainish novel that I hadn't read before. It's not the last in the series, but this is also a companion series, so you can read any of the novels in any order. They all stand on their own, so I could have put this with sci-fi or with sequels, but for evenness of numbers, I put it with sequels. This is probably the most plotty of her work that I've read as well. So I would say this is a great place to start if you haven't read the Hainish novels before. It's short, it's got a very propulsive plot, it's really compelling in terms of the messaging and the stakes. We are in this far future where we have sort of an interplanetary alliance that are managing everything. And there have been a lot of changes, but it's been a long time since people have communicated from this planet with the wider alliance. And this planet was colonized by humans taking over this sort of very passive race, and things go from there. There's a lot of conflict. This is said to be a very strong inspiration for Avatar, the James Cameron film, not Avatar: The Last Airbender. So it has a lot of environmental and imperial themes that it's exploring, and of course Le Guin always is very thematically strong. So that is top point, but the characterization, this has very dynamic, multiple perspectives that we're looking at who all are richly developed. So I just love this. I'm a little heartbroken that it was the end of my new Hainish novels to get to. Next up, best romance in 2023. I had some great romance reading, but it seems to have all been at the end of the year. So all of these were in the past 2 months. First, I have Battle Royal by Lucy Parker. This was such a delight. It does have heavier themes, but the reason I was sold on it was the fluffy baking romance. This was such a delight because it has a very thinly veiled Great British Bake Off aspect. Our two characters are a very whimsical, colorful baker who likes glitter and sprinkles, and the other is very technical. And he was the judge who voted her off of a cooking competition show. And now she's back. She is becoming a new judge of the show, so they have to grudgingly work together. Very grumpy sunshine, but they each have their baggage, and they begin sort of working together to research, competing for a contract to do a royal wedding cake. So we have multiple things going on with their businesses, with the royal wedding, with the show, and yet it all worked. It feels like that should be too much, but it wasn't. They feel like richly developed characters because of all of the things in their backgrounds that we're seeing them uncover, and them slowly getting to know each other and overcome their distaste for one another really, really worked. Then we have Something Wild and Wonderful by Anita Kelly. I blanked there for a minute. Won't be my last from this author. I really, really enjoyed it, and I know they have a couple of other books out, so I'm looking forward to diving in some more, because this was so charming, so well developed. It's really slow and quiet, and yet it just won me over immediately. We are following two guys hiking the Pacific Crest Trail who had never met each other before until they run into each other on the trail, and it's almost sort of an introvert-extrovert romance, because one of them, Alexi, is very, very quiet, and the other, Ben, is very boisterous, very friendly, and he's sort of got that golden retriever energy for sure. And so they both won me over as characters, but this also does have some heavier elements too, so I always look for that in my romances, so that will be throughout all of these, where we have someone who's been through a difficult coming out and is processing that on the trail, but isn't really ready to talk about it. There's also a certain religious element, and dealing with how you process coming out as a religious person. Really, really well handled, I thought. So lovely, lovely book. And the Pacific Crest Trail, like, it gave me all of these vibes of almost wanting to go out and hike. And then I have bad knees. I really can't go out and hike for, hundreds of miles, but man, I was gung-ho to do it because the setting and sense of place was so there. And the third, and this one is one of those cases, as I mentioned earlier, where this is a 4-star book for me because there were some pretty strong editing issues that should be tackled and weren't quite up to the author's standards. But I loved the book. Like, it really is going to stick with me, I think, and that's Zenny by Rebecca Weatherspoon. So I've read a lot of Weatherspoon's work, and I feel this was just not up to par in terms of editing, but the characterization, the writing, the story were so wonderful. So obviously we're following the character Zenny as she's gone back from the city to a small town, and when she's there for a funeral for the person who she probably had the closest relationship with in her life, and she's uncovering some family secrets. But as part of this funeral, there's the reading of the will, of course. And Zenny has been willed a massive fortune she did not know this family member had. So now, what does she do? Mainly because the will requires her to marry someone that she has never met before. So her and this person meet at the will reading, basically, and decide, well, why wouldn't we? If we both are getting something out of it, and we don't have to stay married, we can always get it annulled or divorced. Not a big deal. Nobody really cares these days. So they decide to go along with it, and they decide to actually, let's have a party and make a good time out of it. And they get to know each other. Of course, they fall for each other, and it is just such a heartwarming, sweet, like, adult romance where it is very, very steamy. Like, this is #1 steamy romance I read this year, but it's not about that. It's about really having this mature relationship that's respectful, the way they communicate, and it's beautiful. I loved the relationship, and that is why it has to be on my favorites of the year. Then let's go to general fiction. That's what I'm calling it. I've got a mishmash of stuff. I've got historical, I've got contemporary, I've got a classic in here. I grouped them all together. So first up, let's say Byzantium by Stephen R. Lougheed. This was so great, and I'm very glad it was great because it was the longest book I read this year. So it would have been a real annoyance if it had been a book I didn't like. But this was a sweeping, epic historical, and it's following a monk from what was predating Ireland out on a journey to take the Book of Kells to the Empire of Byzantium. And it is a truly epic journey. They're sort of beset by Vikings right along the way, and the journey goes wrong. And so this is how everything goes wrong and how his course in life completely changes. And he does eventually wind up in Byzantium, his interactions with the Vikings and with the Romans. And oh man, it is sweeping and broad and epic. It just swept me away. I really, really enjoyed it. Next we have my classic, and this is my only reread on here as well, so it's a good thing I reread this one. It's Tess of the D'Urbervilles by Thomas Hardy. I had read this years ago, and I didn't really totally remember it other than that it was very miserable, and I loved it. I brought so much out of this reread because I wouldn't have seen the things I was looking for here before. How kind of feminist Hardy's lens was to the plight of Tess, who is this young woman who has everything in her life go wrong because of the roles that are put on her because of her gender, the expectations of everyone, the ways that people don't respect or expect much of her, and the things that she's just simply expected to deal with. And I loved Hardy's handling of that, even though it is immensely tragic. Then we have Foster by Claire Keegan, another historical, but more toward the modern end, in Ireland, where we're following a single young girl as she is from a family with a ton of kids and they're having another one. So they send her away temporarily during that process in order to be fostered by some distant relatives. And in that experience of her going into this quiet couple's home where she's treated with a certain respect and warmth that she hasn't felt before, certain attention that she hasn't, and the emotional journey she goes on through that experience is so beautiful. It really impacted me, and this is just such a tiny slip of a book. Keegan really knows how to use her words with efficiency. And then we have Diary of a Void by Emma Yagi. This was one of the first books I read in 2023, and it has stuck with me the whole way through. It has such a voice to it, a sense of humor, while also having a lot of great commentary. I've read so many books that I wanted to be this book, and this one actually delivered. So this one is very feminist in that we're following a character who is a young office worker, and she has dealt with some serious sexism in her previous roles. She's just taken a new job and is trying to kind of get a fresh start, and yet everyone is putting the same expectations on her, to the point they're expecting her to do a lot of soft work in the office just because she's the only woman around. And so one day she decides she's not going to put up with it, and she just accidentally blurts out, I can't do that because I'm pregnant. And that changes the trajectory of her life, of this story, because she thinks that she's going to get something out of this, and she doesn't really think through the long-term implications, obviously, when she blurts it out. But in reality, what plays out is seeing that even though people are thinking of her so much more, she's initially getting so much more positive reinforcement about who she is, getting so much more freedom, she realizes all of those things are not about her, and that she's just experiencing a new form of sexism. And even though it's benevolent to her, it's still harming her. It's still putting her in a limited box, and it is really insidious what plays out. And I loved seeing it kind of continually unravel. It doesn't go to a dark place or anything, but it explores the topic of sexism in a really, really smart way. I just loved. Next category is horror, and this was my big growing category. I don't think I've ever had a horror category in my favorites before, but I read a good amount of horror, and I am definitely planning to dive into the genre much more in 2024. So first up, let's do an old favorite, and that's T. Kingfisher. I read several things by T. Kingfisher and could have put all of them on my favorites list, but this was the absolute standout for me, and that's What Moves the Dead. So this is a Poe retelling of Fall of the House of Usher. It was also great timing because the Fall of the House of Usher came out. So I read the original story, What Moves the Dead, and I watched the show. And all of that made this a greater experience combined. But this story was my favorite of all of the Kingfisher works. And it's so wonderful because the tone and the voice is much different from her other works that I read, and yet still very distinctly her. It is certainly adapting to Poe's voice and style. I love that she specifically inserted a botanist character that really is like totally typical of her stories. So that was the standout, that is her putting her fingerprint on it. But this is a short story, so you can't say too much. However, it's a person showing up to an old friend's crumbling manor house. Something is going wrong. They're sick, clearly, and things are not quite right. This is unsettling in many ways. It's very atmospheric, and not surprisingly to me, the care that is given to characterization. T. Kingfisher is always a master of that. So I loved that. The care to the relationships between people, the supportiveness. Alex, our main character, very clearly is there and just desperately wants to help, and that comes across on the page. And that sense of care and support comes through across T. Kingfisher's novels so much, and that's why they are always favorites. Then I will go to Our Wives Under the Sea by Julia Armfield. such a weird and wonderful book. It's slow moving. Very little happens in this book, but it was not what I expected, and yet it was totally exactly what you're sold. So this book is about two women who are married. One of them goes under the sea in a submarine and disappears for a very long time. And when she comes back, she's not quite the same person. Her wife is desperately trying to understand what happened with her, and she's acting stranger and stranger, spending more and more time in the bath. And the wife who stayed home is going through the motions, actions repeatedly every day, trying to get help, trying to find out what happened to her wife while she was gone, and not able to get any forward movement. This is so much about grief and loss. I would say it verges into cosmic horror maybe, but prominently it's probably existential horror, but it's very slow. There's low violence, low graphic content. It's just about the emotions and about processing the sort of philosophical aspects of this. And I thought it was so atmospheric and beautifully executed. And my best horror, this is certainly the standout for me, was Sarah Gailey's Just Like Home. I'm concerned that this is recency bias, but Gailey was a standout for me this year. I read their whole back catalog, and I'm so happy this was the one I finished on because I absolutely loved it. I felt it was just perfectly executed. So this is a haunted house novel, I would say. It could maybe tick the boxes of Gothic, but we have a woman who is returning to her home where something bad clearly had happened before, but she's going back to help her mother die, effectively. Her mother and her have a really strained relationship, and that's playing out as they're trying to sort of prepare for her to be gone and just keeping her going. So it has all of those day-to-day aspects of just maintaining a life as it's struggling to end. But then we're also flashing back to her childhood and understanding the relationship that she had with her mother, with her father, with the house, and what went wrong there in the past. The, again, atmosphere here, so all three of these picks are very strong on atmosphere, but the atmosphere was perfect. The characterization, perfect. The pacing, perfect. I talked about this a lot in my review. Like, this is one of the, for me, like, best examples of pacing in a horror novel, because we have constant, like, a train of setups and payoffs, and it's like you get a relief, and then Gailey starts building the tension again, and then releases it for you, and then builds even more tension. And it just was beautifully executed. So I was on the edge of my seat the whole book. It was so good. On to my best fantasy of 2023. We have Other Birds by Sarah Addison Allen. I had heard about this author for years, and I can't believe I never got to her before now, because this was so utterly delightful. We're following a character who's returning home. This is a contemporary setting in an island off of North Carolina, and it's a very small community. She is going to this even smaller condo community where, when she returns back, someone dies, and she gets involved in cleaning out their home because they were a hoarder. And there's a mystery at the core of this, so maybe this is my best mystery as well. But the mystery is that this person had an item, something they intended to go to a famous author that they had worked for. And this famous author is mysterious and very much a recluse. No one knows who he is really on the island, but he sort of made the island a famous tourist destination. And so there is a dual mystery in that the finding of this item, of seeking it out, and also the identity of this author that we are exploring through this story. But that's not really what the story is about. The story is about the community of this condo group coming together and found family. One of the people there is a chef, and so there are very strong comfort food elements to this that skyrocketed it for me. So this was a warm, cozy book. Loved it. Then the one that's on everybody's list this year, it seems, is Spear Cuts Through Water by Simon Jimenez. I read Vanished Birds last year. I read A Spear Cuts Through Water early this year, and oh my god, he's a new favorite author. Each of his works has been an utter standout. Spear Cuts Through Water is one of the most innovative fantasy novels I have ever read. I cannot believe what he achieved in a small standalone work. It is told in multiple different perspectives, first, second, and third perspective, not multiple individual people, but that also. It's funny, it's epic, it is a sweeping, broad saga of a story, and yet again, it's a single book. It's so hard to get across what this is, but in this epic journey, we're sort of following two men, the story of someone's ancestors. It is a love story. It has some really incredibly innovative magic. It has such a delightful and strange setting. Everything about this just sung. I loved it. This was a total standout for my year. And then of course I had to mention another Gailey novel, that's Magic for Liars. And this one is another sort of mystery-ish, but it's definitely not the best for its mystery element. This is great for its characterization. So Magic for Liars is following a non-magical woman who is going to the magic school where her sister, who is magical, teaches, and there has been a murder there. And so she is a detective who's going to help investigate this situation. And it's so much more about the character. The character is very flawed. Gailey does great flawed characters. And it's an exploration of the relationship between these two sisters, their backgrounds. And it is so much more about characterization than about the mystery plot. The mystery plot keeps things moving forward, but this was such a good novel. And I think this is the one I'm least likely to push into other people's hands and the most missold of Gailey's novels. It's a very hard sell, but it was exactly right for me, and so I loved it. And lastly, we have science fiction. So my best science fiction of 2023 are, let's start with the most obvious one, Chain Gang All-Stars by Kwame Adjei-Brenyah. This has been on everybody's lists because it is really, really great. I had previously read his collection, Friday Black, and the first story of that is probably one of my favorite stories ever. So hard-hitting. They're all kind of near-future sci-fi dystopian in the realm of Black Mirror, very specifically commentating on capitalism as a major element and race. And this is no different. So those are the main themes of this book. We're in a near-future dystopian story where things have progressed in the American prison system to the point of people having an opportunity to win their freedom if they fight in tournament death matches. So that's a very gruesome, graphically violent premise that plays out on the page, but we also see in the background a lot more. We're getting many, many perspectives. So we're not just in prisoner fighters' perspectives. We're seeing people who are going from just being a prisoner to how they get drawn into this system. We see the spectators, because this has become sort of a reality competition show almost, and there are fans. We're seeing people in journalistic roles who are trying to report on this. We're seeing family members as they're having to process their family going through this and what they feel about that family member who may be a criminal. Do they want them to get out? Do they want them to die in a death battle? And what makes this so elevated and so much stronger than many other sci-fi works out there is that there are a lot of footnotes in here, and those footnotes in many cases are references to real things that are happening in our prison system in the US right now. And so that's the most powerful part, because you're reading these horrific things on the page, and then you are seeing real references to how that horrific thing that you just thought was not quite real is actually completely grounded. And all of the worst stuff is very grounded in reality. And even as someone who is pretty in touch with how horrible our prison system is, and the corporatization of it, and the exploitation of prisoners, and particularly people of color, it was very, very jaw-dropping to read. So even as someone who's very informed, it was delivered in such a way that it really adds up into something bigger, more impactful, and very moving. And so even with all the gruesome and violent content, I still think this was hard-hitting and not exploitative novel in what it's trying to get across. It feels like it was very timely and meaningful in the storytelling. So man, it was one of the hardest hitting stories I read this year. Then we have A Slice of Mars by Guerric Hache. It is a far-flung future sci-fi set on Mars, as we have a group of kind of STEM nerds who are trying to start a pizza restaurant on Mars, where pizza is not very popular. And it isn't cozy, but it has a lot of charming found family elements. And we have an Earthling who has just arrived who kind of gets swept up with this group. And he is our vehicle as the reader, I think, to expose the world building of Mars, because in this future, the Earth and Mars have sort of split. They're both inhabited, but very different politically and economically. And the way they got there was very violent. So there's a lot of trauma in the past surrounding that split. The Earth is extremely corporatist and very controlling of their people, while Mars is a collectivist society. And we aren't getting that through big info dumps or like epic occurrences. We're getting it through the mundane day-to-day happenings living on Mars, things like going grocery shopping. That's how we find out how different this living experience is. And I just loved that aspect, how it's ingenious to tell the story that way, because you're truly taking us through the day-to-day life. It is also not about running the pizza shop. It's about the difficult decisions to be made as a group, the butting of heads between this group who are kind of finding their footing together, because it's about putting together a crew, basically. This is effectively a crew novel. Pulling together this group who have different ideas about how they might like this business to work, about what they like or dislike in pizza even, and trying to find their way forward. There are some bigger elements kind of to what I was saying. There's a lot of trauma in the backgrounds of some of these characters. There are a lot of traumatic elements within the society about where it came from and what they're looking forward to. So there are some really big thematic sci-fi elements there, but they're explored so much at the personal level. So I loved that. I loved the way that this explores kind of gender and sexuality in a queer norm setting really, really well. And just everything about this felt like it was handled with so much care. And I love the way that these characters genuinely come together as a crew and care enough to communicate with each other. And I just felt this was what I needed in a sci-fi story at the moment, because it is exploring big sci-fi themes at the personal, individual level. And lastly, on my favorites list is The Mountain and the Sea by Ray Naylor. I mentioned Naylor up in the short fiction because I had picked that up to try it to see if I wanted to get into Mountain and the Sea, and it sold me, and so I did. So Mountain and the Sea is a sort of a first contact novel, but not with aliens. And obviously, based on the cover and the premise, it's octopuses. So this imagines, it's so creative and sweeping. It's a novel of ideas about what would it take for octopuses to be able to form language, to form community, to require language, because octopuses are very solitary. So we have a mostly STEM nerd casting, much like the last one. And I think this novel doesn't work for everyone because of that aspect, because here the characters are a little dry for some people's liking. And for me, that works because they're in many cases reading non-neurotypical or an actual cyborg in one case. And so if you need a very emotional character to attach to, that is not really present here. There's not a lot of that internal perspective that has turmoil. Things are very practical, pragmatic throughout, but I just loved it as a true, like, grounded scientific fiction story. I was so enamored with the elements of first contact with intelligence and artificial intelligences, those put up against each other. Really fantastic. I think there are some strong aspects of capitalism to this one, which I saw the echoes of in his short fiction as well, that are explored critically here. And I just thought it was a really great first novel. I think he could expand even more. And so basically this got me extremely excited because the ideas here are really fascinating and fresh to me. He immediately put himself on the map of sci-fi for me, that I'm looking forward to whatever he puts out next. I think he has a novella out actually this month or maybe next month, very beginning of 2024. So I will be continuing along with whatever Ray Naylor does next. So that is it for my favorites of 2024. It's a lengthy list. I couldn't possibly cut it down anymore. And actually, I guess I should throw out there my best author of 2024. I have already mentioned them multiple times, but it has to be Sarah Gailey. when I started working through my list, I had all of the books I had read from Gailey on my list, and I slowly like whittled them down. But I read, I think, 4 things from Gailey this year, and all of them were standout, memorable works. And so I'm so glad I got to completing their backlist this year, because it was truly a really shining example of a strong collection of work where every single one is doing something different and really sticks in your mind. If I had to narrow things down out of these to what my absolute top books were, the ones that really have stuck in my head through the entire year and I don't think are going anywhere would probably be Tess of the D'Urbervilles, A Slice of Mars, and A Spear Cuts Through Water. Those 3 just have not budged in me feeling like they were complete standouts as soon as I read them, and I think they are going to continue that way. I think Just Like Home might be there, but I don't know if that's recency bias. So I'm sitting on that one. That may be up there with these other 3 though. But I think those probably would be my top best books if I had to say. So that is it for my very lengthy list of favorites of 2023. Let me know if you've read and liked these books. Let me know if you have your own favorites list. I love to see them. I know everybody kind of says it and it sounds like it's cheesy or not true, but legitimately I draw so many recommendations from favorites lists. So whether you have your own videos of favorites, link them down below, or if you don't have your own channel, please let me know what your favorite books were, because I absolutely do pick out reads from people's favorites list throughout the year. It really influences me so much. So that is it for me today. Thank you so very much for watching.